featured speaker tonight will be Mr. Don Maki. All right, Don is director of ELCAT and wears many hats at the school there. He teaches classes, and I'm sure he'll give you a little rundown of what he's involved with in his 80-hour work week here for the town. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Don Maki.
Thank you, my friend. So, thank you. First, I'd like to introduce again my friend Nick Hansman in the back, running the camera tonight, recording this to go on ELCAT. And thank you all, and thanks to Bruce for inviting me tonight. And today is April 19th. So I want to begin by acknowledging Patriots Day and tell you that when Bruce first approached me about speaking here tonight, I was in the middle of rereading a pair of biographies of John Adams. One, the David McCullough book that became the very popular, if somewhat overwrought, HBO film, and an older one that belonged to my father that was published in 1949, written by a woman named Catherine Drinker Bowen. And I really liked that one because it deals more with Adams' childhood, his background and upbringing, and then his education at Harvard, which he entered in 1751 at the age of 16. I wanted to say something about Adams in honor of Patriots Day because of his commitment to the cause of intellectual liberty and his commitment to pursuit of the truth. He had a lot of insight into the new nation and to its future. He thought about it in terms of the future, and I just wanted to recognize his commitment to reason, which in my dealings with 16-year-olds today, I see as one of the most important things that we can be doing in terms of education is reminding students, young people, but all of us, of the importance of reason and pursuit of the truth. I have to confess that I brought a lot of notes here. I don't do a lot of public speaking, so please forgive me if I pause here because I lose my place pretty easily. Bruce did ask me to speak first briefly about what I do as the ELCAT director more generally. ELCAT, and I suspect, certainly knowing the crowd here, you all know what ELCAT is, but it's a community television station. It's operated by the town of East Longmeadow. It's funded by revenue that's generated from a franchise agreement that the town negotiates with the cable company. That all came about really not in East Longmeadow, but at the beginning of the cable industry back in the late 70s and the early 80s, when the switch to cable broadcasting it's actually not broadcasting, when it was made from broadcasting to cable. Because, as you all certainly well remember, in the days of earlier days of broadcasting, when I was growing up, the broadcasters were licensed to use what were called then, and there were a lot more of them than there are now, the public airwaves. They're still out there, but they're not public the way they used to be. So the access stations were developed as a way to ensure on a private cable network, which was proprietary, the cable companies owned that system from start to finish, unlike the airwaves. There needed to be a provision, people felt, for the public to have access to that. So these access centers were created and funded by the cable companies so that people in any given community, wherever there was a franchise, would have access to equipment, training, and facilities to be able to make community programming and distribute that within that town's network. So in East Longmeadow, back in the early and mid-90s, ELCAT was actually a very active access station. They covered some town government at the time, recorded a lot of school events, 4th of July parade. There were quite some number of volunteers. The studio used to be down on Shaker Road. And then it lapsed for a while, and I have really used what they did at that time as a model. Looking back, we have a lot of archived tapes from those days, but really the approach was to use the Access Center to reflect what was going on in the community. In 2005, I started volunteering for ELCAT, taping meetings. And then as my kids got older and I had a little bit more time, I worked with my two predecessors to really think about the long-range plans for ELCAT, what it could become. We were in the middle of renegotiating a license at that time, and I really focused on two priorities. The first one was investing in new equipment, digital equipment, to meet the demands of new standards of production quality and workflow. And the second was to really develop strong relationships with the school community, the civic community, civic organizations, the clubs, and the people in town government, so that we could draw on all those sources for new and interesting programming. And also, I had hoped to recruit volunteers. We did get a few, and I'm sure you're familiar with the people who are still pretty active producing programs for us. Alan Sue Grimaldi in particular generate a lot of programming for us on ELCAT. On March 30th, just passed, let me go back, because I volunteered for some period of time, became pretty active, and then in 2008, actually September of 2008, I took over as the full-time director. And so in that 3.5 years roughly, on March 30th, we aired our 75th consecutive edition, weekly edition of ELCAT News, which was a real sort of a milestone for us. And that was also, coincidentally, our 1,000th program that was produced here by either ELCAT or our volunteers since September of 2008. So we were happy to mark that milestone. Those 1,000 programs include all our coverage of the town's elected boards, town meeting, high school sports, concerts, the local history programs that we've done with Bruce, programs from the Council on Aging and the Senior Friendship Club, the public library, series of programs that my staff and interns have produced on local museums, natural areas, and regional events. And then we do also provide coverage of those civic organizations like the Rotary, the Lions, and the Garden Club through Susan and Al. And they also produce a lot of programs of local and regional interest. So a lot of my time now is spent really devoted to high school students. I teach 2 classes of video production each semester. We have a media club that has about 20 to 25 members. And we really provide opportunities for any student with any interest at all in any kind of media production to have access to the studio, to come in, tell us what they'd like to do, and somehow get involved with ELCAT, either through ELCAT directly as part of the media club, or really just on their own time. Any student that has an interest, we try to encourage that. They shoot sports, concerts, meetings, and events like this. They do interviews, they produce special segments for the news. They do play-by-play for the games. We've got a couple of boys now doing the baseball games, varsity baseball games. They make music videos, short films, and co-anchor our weekly news broadcasts. Students in other classes use the equipment to create class projects, such as interviews. We had a couple of students do a wonderful interview. One of them dressed up in costume as a southern plantation owner, and the other conducted the interview. And they did this just as a class assignment, but it was a great interview. They did a wonderful job. It was well researched and well acted, And it was quite compelling, actually. So again, we provide, that kind of support within the school for them to do that, and I encourage the teachers all the time to, let their kids, if they're interested, come down and, maybe use video, use our resources to create, media-centered projects for school. And on most days, we usually have 2 or 3 kids who just come down to have lunch, which is really one of the nicest parts about being down there. And lastly, I just want to talk with respect to ELCAT and what we're doing at the school. We have a new collaboration with Mark Macarini, who runs the Career Center there. And we've got a small group of students who have really we've gotten together and created this new project called Step One. And they've formed really a sort of a production company within ELCAT for this project called Step One Media. And we've come up with graphics and letterheads and cards and the whole thing. And it's a way for them to reach out to the business community, and we're going to create a series of programs that highlight the businesses while showing students the skills and the planning necessary from both the education and the business perspectives to help them pursue their interests and really develop their career goals. So I think it's a very cool partnership. Step One is an acronym that we, as a group, sort of brainstormed and came up with for Student to Enterprise Partnerships Uniting Communities. So we have kind of a slick-looking graphic for it. It's quite professional looking. And it's a great project that I think will connect people with the community in new ways and really give them a better understanding of how businesses work and how they succeed in East Longmeadow, and what opportunities they offer to students. It'll require them to apply real-world skills that build productive relationships, encourage commitment, creativity, and innovation, and emphasize, and this is really at the heart of what I want to say tonight and talk about, emphasize the importance of the local community as a context in which they learn the effective and ethical use of new information and communication tools. We have enthusiastic support from the Chamber of Commerce and a pilot project already underway with Charlie Christensen and CMD Technologies down on Baldwin Street here in town. And while this is just one of the many ways that we try to connect to the community, it does encapsulate what I see as the essence of what I think we need to engage young people with to look to the future. So I just really want to talk a little bit about my vision and where that comes from. And it actually does have something to do with John Adams. If we actually associate Patriots Day with anything other than the Boston Marathon at this point, it's with that familiar image of men in homespun sort of throwing aside their pitchforks and grabbing up their muskets to meet the British as they're marching toward Lexington and Concord. But we don't really think of them laying aside their books, their letters, their almanacs, their gazettes. And they did. Many of them were as well read as their present-day counterparts. And they certainly better understood the historical, philosophical, and political antecedents that shaped their aspirations at that time. They were farmers, tradesmen, merchants, and tavern keepers who were committed to defending more than just their livelihoods and their farms. They fought just as fiercely, I think, for the liberty of reason and practical thought that had allowed them to build a prosperous new nation under the protections of the English law that was now being used to trammel them. These were men and women who read, corresponded, published letters, newspapers, pamphlets, and they argued openly for their interests in their homes and in taverns and town meetings. Their Puritan forebears had framed into the early square New England meeting house. Not this, but you look at where this comes from. Really the first formal expression of American moral and civic self-government. And they had established compulsory education and infused every pursuit with thrift, industry, and a belief in their own exceptionalism. So 100 years later, rationalism and Enlightenment thinking had been grafted onto those early Puritan civic forms, so that the patriots of 1775 wholly rejected for themselves and their children the narrow mind and its authoritarian concept of law. But they had retained the Puritan belief in the newness of the American idea. And that idea of American newness is something that really is still with us, and it's so ingrained in American culture. And it really began with the Puritans. So they, those patriots retained that. And in their vision for the American future, it was what guided them. They were compelled to rebellion I beg your pardon. What compelled them to rebellion was that they, not the crown, possessed, nurtured, and prospered from their own curiosity, ingenuity, and ambition. And it was to that American future that they determined their hands and their minds be bent, unconstrained by hereditary privilege or authoritarianism. And it was in these closely knit communities in New England that the citizens read in their gazettes and their pamphlets, and they argued the reasoning for or against the American cause. They argued the merits of it with their neighbors, and they measured the validity of those arguments against the events and the circumstances of their daily pursuit of prosperity and happiness. And happiness was, for John Adams, the sole end of government. And it was an end derived in the minds of all those whom he called, quote, sober inquirers after truth. And I think it's fair to insist that that sober inquiry after truth in the great minds that reasoned, fought for, and ultimately formed the American government was the cornerstone of its foundation. Yet even Adams himself was doubtful that it would necessarily be so. We may please ourselves with the prospect of free and popular governments, he wrote to his friend James Warren, but there is a great danger that these governments will not make us happy. God grant they may, but I fear in every assembly members will obtain an influence by noise, not sense, by meanness, not greatness, by ignorance, not learning, and by contracted hearts, not large souls. Which gets us immediately to the present, doesn't it? Let me just say, as much as we venerate them, it's a mistake to look back at the patriots of the American Revolution as if they were somehow more virtuous than we are, or less afflicted by the meaner motives and impulses of human nature. Of course they struggled with them, and they'd be lesser patriots if they hadn't. Where they succeeded was in applying to those motives and impulses the regulating principles of reason and ingenuity, an honest appraisal of human nature, and an experimental approach to truth, which was, at the time, simultaneously laying the foundations of modern scientific discovery and propelling the Western world into the technological age. So that's the truth I'm talking about here. What I mean by discernible truth, the truth of science, of inquiry, the application of reason. So they valued discernment more than we seem to today. They counted their money and their words, as Adams said, and weighed the practical benefits of fostering honesty and trust in the social, civic, and commercial intercourse they carried on each day in their own communities. These were new ideas in the 18th century, and they had become distinctly American ideas. And they were the ideas that really formed what people like Thomas Paine wrote were the only legitimate basis for formation of the American government. So, with that background, how does our current sense of community here in East Longmeadow coincide with the power of our media to impact our attitude toward trust, truth, and the role of discernment in the information age? And I call it the misinformation age in my title, simply to point out what does seem to me to be a devaluation, if not a corruption, of the idea of discernible truth. I don't see much concern for the value of truth in what passes for discourse in the media today. Opinion is king, and the more bellicose it is, the more the advertisers are willing to pay. In today's journalism, objectivity has been, to use an old term, vulgarized. to mean nothing in reference to objective truth, but simply putting opposing opinions into a pen like a pair of roosters and watching the spurs and the feathers fly. The devaluation of objective truth comes paradoxically with the unprecedented access we have to raw knowledge and information in the digital age. Recent advances in miniaturization have exponentially increased the power of microprocessors to handle the flow of information more quickly over vastly more complex networks. And that processing power means we can create and apply more complex algorithms, formulas that sort and filter and reconstitute all that information into new kinds of knowledge and new kinds of meaning, which makes it very susceptible to manipulation. So Google, for example, and I don't know if you know this, filters your search results based on past queries, which means if I happen to be a music historian and Bruce happens to be a political historian, and each of us types John Adams into the typical Google search box, we're very likely to get different John Adamses for our first result. Now, I think most people, when they type into Google a search term, assume that Google is just sort of this neutral thing that's going to return the results based on everybody's accumulated interest. But they're not. They're filtering that on Bruce's computer, on your computer, on my computer, relative to what we've searched for in the past. So the fact that they do this means that if the more we use tools like Google to point us toward objective information, objective sources of information, if that pointing is based on personal preferences, it has a big impact on what we think of as objectivity. It changes the nature of objectivity. And we have to contend with that, but my friend Nick's generation are the ones that are going to have to solve that problem and redefine what that means in the future. So it's really the ability to manipulate these materials at the atomic scale, and that's what we can do now. They can actually move atoms around individually. And it makes these powerful new processors possible, which in turn allows us, to process all this information in billionths of seconds. And it's that technology, it's not the tools themselves, it's those breakthroughs that make the tools possible, things like smartphones, high-speed internet, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and arguably, as we remember last year, the revolution in Egypt, which really came about because of Facebook and Twitter. That's what enabled those people to communicate with each other and plan those protest marches. And the fact that it was all visible right out there to the entire world meant, as far as the Egyptian government was concerned, that they had to make a calculation as to what they were going to do to respond. So it's possible to send an instant text message to someone around the corner or around the world, to capture and distribute pictures or live video that allows the entire world to witness an event on any street, in any neighborhood, in any city, in any country in the world, and on something like this. Now, I'm going to ask you this question. What percentage of the world's population right now, today, has one of these?
80%.
Well,
83.
honestly, it's 80. Yeah, you're right. It's just over 80%. 80%. So over 6 billion people in the world have one of these devices, and thus the ability to communicate with every one of those other 6 billion people instantaneously. That's a huge transformation in the relationship between the individual and his community, and the individual and his power to communicate ideas. It's mind-boggling. So, from my perspective, that's the fundamental problem of education. It's more important than test scores or all the other stuff that we spend a lot of time and money on in education, which I'm not saying isn't valuable, But this is a huge problem or opportunity for his generation. Because the social and physical boundaries that define communities for 16-year-olds have been obliterated by this new frontier. So to get back to why am I here? If the barriers to this instantaneous dissemination of ideas among 6 billion individuals, and that's growing daily, why do we even need an archaic local access station that reaches 5,000 subscribers within the boundaries of East Longmeadow to empower people to share ideas? Because people can share ideas with anybody on the planet. Well, there are things that we can do at the local level that the internet and global connectivity can't do. And so really my job is to sort out, well, what are those things, and to try to do them. It's hard to look out across the wasteland of our media landscape now today, the erosion of our political and cultural discourse, and not feel overwhelmed by the power of this mass media. You know, parents see their kids texting all the time, on the phone all the time, the TV's on all the time, they're on the internet all the time, and it's not just the kids. And people feel like they're powerless. It's just too big. 6 billion people talking to each other. How are you going to stop that? So we sort of go through these steps. And the first impulse is always nostalgic, right? Like to think back to the good old days of Walter Cronkite. Well, Walter Cronkite was a terrific man, I'm sure, and he was like the most trusted man in America. But he chronicled assassinations, race riots, the Vietnam War, shootings at Kent State. In short, he brought to our living rooms for a decade and longer conflict, discontent, and tragedies that defined the decade that traces back to the fundamental premise that goes back to the Puritans, that America was not really thought of as a place, but as an idea that was constantly compelled, no matter how disruptive the process, to reinvent itself. The trajectory rose at the close of the decade to the barren surface of the moon, 1969. And it's interesting to think back to what we thought of our future when we watched Neil Armstrong step down into that gray, lifeless dust. That was an amazing moment when everything was future-oriented. Here's this great new possibility. And it's interesting to note that the Puritans landing on American soil had described this continent, for all its vast, rich resources and beauty and indigenous culture, they described it as the Lord's wasteland. So the next impulse is to attribute to today's young people the faults of character. Short-sightedness, laziness, selfishness, disrespect for authority, disrespect for our sacrifice that every adult generation, since at least Socrates, has attributed to the next generation. We never really trust that they're going to do the job quite as well as we did. We assume they're going to cut corners, they're going to lose interest, they're going to muck things up unless we fill them with all our own prescriptions and instructions about how we want things done. And we call that education. The third impulse is to address the problem head-on by imposing on the future some arbitrary condition or rule from the past as if it will actually restore that past condition. And this is the reactive response to the realization that things have changed in a way that we might not like, and that we need to somehow get everybody to go back and try again. But, of course, it never works that way. It's more like, you break it, you bought it. And another aspect of that response is to close ourselves off somehow from the influences that other places and other cultures bring through these media tools, as if open access now to 6 billion other people can somehow be turned off. Well, there is one country that's done so. There's one country on the planet where there's actually less than half the population that has a cell phone. That's North Korea, which tells you something about isolationism as a solution. I mean, 3% of the people in North Korea have a cell phone, and therefore you have North Korea. I mean, it's somewhat frightening. The thing about all these impulses, in my view, is that they define an outlook that's a backward-looking outlook, if that makes sense. And it grates the mind, the young mind, that's full of looking forward. The young mind is always looking forward. The young mind sees the wasteland the way the Puritans saw the wasteland. And as we saw the moon that August evening in 1969, a bare slate, a new beginning, and the ground of possibility. And I think we really do misjudge kids when we think they expect us to give them everything, or that we think that they expect us to do everything. I don't really see that in these kids. I don't. I'm with them every day. If anything, I would say they see us as the ones insisting on defining everything for them, telling them what to be interested in, telling them what to learn, how to learn it, how to be smarter, how to win, how to get ahead, how to get into college. Maybe as a result, how to be as harried and stressed as we are. And then how to express the proper gratitude for helping them achieve so much success. What I think they want us to say is, here it is, this world we've given you. Maybe we've done our best, maybe we haven't. It's sort of a mess. Here are some useful tools that you'll need to work on fixing it. Curiosity, ambition, perseverance, but the two most important ones are love and a respect for the truth. We'll trust you to go figure it out. Go see what you can do. No one in history has ever actually tried this approach. So I think we need to start by trusting our kids. And then we need to do as we say. We need to be honest. Who of us doesn't carry the burden of having hurt someone with a lie? Of betraying someone's trust? Who of us hasn't been persuaded by representations that appealed to us but turned out not to be true? We all know how difficult it can be to hear the truth, to speak the truth sometimes, or to insist on it from others. And those emails that get forwarded to us from friends of friends of friends of friends about this Democrat or that Republican make us cringe. But 90% of the time, it isn't true. But do we stop and investigate whether those things are true? Or do we think our friends are liars for sending them to us? No, we don't. But when we abandon the primacy of truth for the expediency of securing power or advancing what may be an admirable policy goal, or just affirming our own opinion because we just know the other guy's opinion is wrong, we've demonstrated to our children, who see everything we do more clearly than we do, that we can't ever trust them. Because by letting the truth slip away like that, we've abandoned one of the two most important tools they'll need to sustain a free and open community and go out and build a free and open world. The third thing we can do, if we take care of the first two, is to restore to our own communities the role of fostering and nurturing the values we claim to cherish by exercising them openly, vigorously, and honestly. So that means transparent government. It means integrity in business and commerce. It means participating in the civic life of the town. It means setting an example as an informed citizen and a conscientious voter. It means behaving like an adult when your kid's team is getting clobbered and not berating the coach in front of your child. It means helping your neighbors and not just when disaster strikes. It means volunteering. It means open-minded discussion and constructive disagreement in the public square. Not behind the technology, but in front of the technology. And not simply to persuade, but to listen and learn. Not to find fault for its own sake, but to model the habits of curiosity, inquiry, discernment, respect, and humility for the sake of those whom we must, either with fear or confidence, entrust the future. So I see all of these things every day in this community. And I don't see all of these things reflected in the virtual communities, in the discussion forums, Facebook. I don't see them reflected on the cable news shows or the reality shows. I don't see them modeled in the empty cynicism of political campaigns, nor in the cynicism of the media that exploits that emptiness. And we all say it, we all see it, but we really have to look very hard and very critically at what we do. If the barriers to instant dissemination of ideas to 6 billion individuals have been crossed, what can a local cable access channel do to empower people to share ideas? And so there are these things that we can do at the local level that the internet and connectivity can't. We can make visible the ways communities, and we as a community, accept and act upon our civic, cultural, and educational responsibilities. That's what we do. We show all this stuff. We go out and show games. We show meetings. We do events like this to just make those encounters visible, because those are the encounters on a daily basis that do build trust. At the personal level, at the level of me coming before you, those are things that foster integrity in relationships. And if we make that visible as a community and insist on it, that I'm not going to stand up here and say extreme things just to gain political advantage. Because in families, in small groups, that's much harder to do. So let's use that. And community media can do that at the local level with people in the community. It's the only thing, it's the only tool that can do that. Because the commercial media is not going to do it. The larger internet communities just aren't interested. So I think that's one role that local access media can play. It can provide, through all these same platforms of communication that commercial mass media uses, an alternative diet of media content. And it can give to young people, and this is what I try to do every day at high school, ways to learn what these electronic information tools are capable of, and to empower them to use them responsibly, critically, and effectively as creators, innovators, and pioneers in this future of great promise. Because I think there is a future of great promise. As hard as it is to look out and see what we describe as a wasteland and feel overwhelmed, the potential of these tools is tremendous. And certainly for other people who have not had the benefit that we've had in this country. So there is a huge opportunity. And I'm very happy and feel very privileged to be in charge and able to work with kids and work with the community to try to meet that responsibility. So I just want to finish with a story about John Adams' experience at Harvard that was related in Catherine Bowen's book that sums up really in one short paragraph what it's just taken me a half hour to say. When John Adams was a sophomore at Harvard, he sat one morning with his 23 classmates in the laboratory of Professor John Winthrop. The room contained a huge brass orrery, which is a model of the solar system. A 24-foot telescope, sextants, balances, and a large pendulum. Sir Isaac Newton had been dead for less than 30 years. And Winthrop brought up gravitation. "Do you believe it?" he asked them. And John Adams hesitated before answering, but a few of the other boys nodded agreeably. And rather than commend their unquestioning acceptance, Winthrop glowered at them. "Sheep!" he shouted. "Newton didn't even believe it." And he pointed across the room and said, "There's the pendulum. Go prove it for yourselves, as Newton had to prove it." So I think that's the spirit of truth that we owe our children and our grandchildren. So honor them in commemoration of this Patriots' Day by trusting in their doubts and in the power of their minds and hearts to imagine a future of great promise and possibility. Thank you.